The RX 7900 XT looks like the best entry-level 4K gaming GPU this generation. Previously, I showed how it will overclock up to RTX 4080 levels of performance. But will the RDNA 3 architecture on the large Navi 31 die allow that performance to translate into games? Let's get into it. The 7900 XT is a much maligned and overlooked GPU this generation since AMD launched it with a ridiculously high price and it just received horrible reviews. You know what they say about making a great first impression. Since then, the price has been coming down to what I said way back then was an interesting price. And with a little overclocking of the GPU and VRAM and then increasing the power limit and undervolting, last time we saw an 11% increase in performance that brings it up to RTX 4080 levels. And when I look at the specs of this GPU, it just screams, I'm a real 4K GPU. And historically, spending $700 to $800, you would get a GPU that could provide that high-end gaming experience. Even when I estimated the performance after the announcement in November, I was only 2% off, but it suggested that the 7900 XT is way better than a 4070 Ti and closer to the 4080. Instead, the 7900 XT is always compared with the 4070 Ti, which is not a 4K GPU. The 4070 Ti has a memory bus that was intentionally limited, and that memory bandwidth is fine for 1440p, but it is limiting at 4K and will become increasingly so with future games. I did resolution scaling benchmarks to demonstrate this with the 4070 Ti and my 3090, as the 3090 has almost double the bandwidth of the 4070 Ti. I'll leave a link above if you're interested. If we quickly compare the specs of the 4070 Ti to the 7900 XT, you see a massive difference. The 7900 XT has 20 gigabytes of VRAM. The 4070 Ti only has 12. The 7900 XT has a 320-bit memory bus. The 4070 Ti only has a 192-bit bus. The 7900 XT has a memory bandwidth of 800 gigabytes per second, while the 4070 Ti is at 500. The XT has 60% greater memory bandwidth. Could you imagine how much better the 4070 Ti would be at 4K if it had a memory bandwidth of the 7900 XT? You would have no reason to spend more on the 4080, which is why NVIDIA designed a limit in. If you want a 4K gaming GPU from NVIDIA, they want you to spend $1,200 on the 4080. That leaves the 7900 XT as the only 4K GPU in that historical price class of $700 to $800. And the stock TimeSpy Extreme score on the 7900 XT crushes the 4070 Ti. With the 4080 just 15% faster in gaming and the 7900 XT able to overclock 11% higher, is it really possible to get near 4080 levels of performance and save up to $500 for that 4K gaming GPU? I tested the following games at 4K and max settings to see the performance improvement of the overclock. Starting from the left, in A Plague Tale Requiem, it went from 58 FPS stock to 64 overclocked for a nice 10% gain in performance. In Modern Warfare 2, it went from 89 to 99 FPS for an 11% improvement, and in Hogwarts Legacy, it went from 71 to 79 FPS for another 11% gain. And I could just stop here and say, wahoo! The overclock of the 7900 XT does translate to games, and you get a 10 to 11% increase in performance to get close to a 4080. But that would not be the complete story. Because if I show you the next 4 games I tested in Cyberpunk, Red Dead 2, Assassin's Creed, and Forza 5, the overclocking gains are not as impressive. To see this behavior, I plotted the gains over the overclock in percent. Again, the first 3 on the left show more than a 10% gain. However, in Cyberpunk, it was an 8% gain, and then in Red Dead 2 and Valhalla, they're about a 6% gain. Finally, in Forza 5, down to 5%. And in testing other games, the gains were less than 5%. I did testing in Shadow of the Benchmarks across all 3 resolutions from 1080p to 4K. At 4K, the overclock provides an 8.5% performance gain. At 1440p, it was 7.1%, and at 1080p, it dropped to 3.8%. And that trend is the same with the other games as well. With this GPU, you'll see the biggest overclocking gains at 4K. And with this being a 4K GPU, I wanted to understand how would it do in ray tracing both before and after the overclock. Starting with the Port Royal benchmark, the RTX 4080 scored 17,880. Next is the stock 7900 XT, where we see it at 13,871. The 4080 is 29% higher in performance and clearly in a whole tier higher level of performance than the 7900 XT in ray tracing. When doing the overclock on the 7900 XT, the score increases to 15,149 or 9.2% higher. That does close the gap with the 4080, however, the 4080 is still 18% faster than the overclocked 7900 XT. And the 4070 Ti scores 13,283. So the 7900 XT is clearly more similar to the 4070 Ti in ray tracing than a 4080. Looking at the game Cyberpunk, which I consider to be the most impressive game with ray tracing, at 4K, ray tracing ultra setting, and no upscaling, the 4080 averages 29 FPS. The stock 7900 XT is at 17.9 FPS. So the 4080 is 62% faster in this game at these settings. Overclocking the 7900 XT and it climbs to 19.5 FPS, which is a 9.3% increase and the same scaling we saw in Port Royal. However, the 4080 is still 48% faster. If ray tracing is very important to you and you need a reason to spend $500 more for the 4080, this is the reason. NVIDIA is the leader in ray tracing performance. Lastly, the 4070 Ti gets 22 FPS. So even the 4070 Ti is 12% faster than the overclocked 7900 XT in Cyberpunk. Finally, throwing in my 3090 at the far right, even that gets 21 FPS and is 7% faster, and you can see that the 7900 XT is comparable to that level of ray tracing. From AMD's presentation slides, they spent a lot of time on making ray tracing better this generation. But I won't go through any claims AMD made as they lost their credibility with the launch of RDNA 3. But looking at the Port Royal benchmark and replacing the 4080 with the 6950 XT, wait, where did he get that 6950 XT? I'll talk about that later. The stock 7900 XT is 29% faster, and when overclocked, it is 41% faster than last generation. This is a good comparison since we are looking at 84 RDNA 3 compute units versus 80 RDNA 2 compute units. Looking at the performance in Cyberpunk, and again, replacing the 4080 with the 6950, and you see the stock 7900 XT is 43% faster. And when overclocked, the 7900 XT is 57% faster. The performance gains in ray tracing of RDNA 3 over RDNA 2 are very, very impressive. I don't think AMD gets enough credit for this level of improvement in ray tracing this generation. By the way, if you like benchmarking and analysis videos like this, like, share, and subscribe. And let me know in the comments below if you were buying a 4K GPU for about the same money. Would you buy a 7900 XT or a 4070 Ti? If you are looking for a 4K GPU, then NVIDIA wants you to pay $1,200 while the 7900 XT can be had for under $8. And if you can get one on sale for about $700, this is comparable to last generation pricing where the RX 6800 XT or the RTX 3080 were capable of gaming at 4K. You would think one generation of GPU architecture later, that with technological progress and innovation, you should get more 4K FPS for your dollar. Not for NVIDIA. They are now offering you a 1440p GPU for $800. In a lot of ways, this look into RDNA 3 just reminds me of my experience with my Vega 64. For those who don't know, the Vega GPU was a computing beast. When you compare the FP32 computing capability of the Vega 64 to its competition at the time in the GTX 1080 and 1080 Ti, the Vega with over 12 teraflops of performance tops the chart. You would think it would compete well with the 1080 Ti and easily beat the 1080. However, when it launched in 2017 in gaming, Vega 64 was 5% slower than a 1080. 5 years later, with newer DX12 titles and fine wine driver development, they have swapped, and now the 1080 is 5% slower. And when we look at RDNA 3 and its computing performance, we see a similar trend. The FP32 performance of RDNA 3 more than doubled versus RDNA 2, and the 7900 XT at 51 teraflops looks like it should compete with the 4080 and easily beat the 4070 Ti. But if we look at the overall gaming performance, the 7900 XT is just 3% faster than a 4070 Ti. Even the die size comparison is eerily similar. Back then, Vega used a large 500mm squared die, and the GTX 1080 had a die just over 300mm squared. Now, the 7900 XT, chiplets combined, is just over 500mm squared, while the 4070 Ti die is just under 300mm squared. The RDNA 3 architecture appears to have moved to a more compute-focused architecture. If we look at Tom's Hardware where they tested the performance in Blender, the 7900 XT is 54% faster than the 6950 XT and 60% faster than the 6900 XT. Computationally, these are massive gains, but we didn't get that in gaming. We never got those significantly increased frequencies. And don't forget, AMD did add all those transistors for AI cores. It makes me wonder if AMD saw the coming boom in AI demand and they changed the RDNA 3 architecture to improve compute performance. And while they benefited compute, it came at the expense of gaming performance. Chips and Cheese has a well-written article on the RDNA 3 architecture, and I highly recommend you check it out. Link below. With the new dual-issue architecture, AMD can optimize for games by replacing known shaders with hand-optimized assembly, since the compiler technology isn't up to the task. But even if they did that, it's not clear how much of an effort it would take and how much of a performance benefit it would provide in gaming. And with the launch of the RX 7000 series of GPUs fundamentally complete, and now every resource being pulled into AI, I'm not going to hold my breath that will ever happen. 9 months after launch, Hardware in Box just re-reviewed the 7900 XT, and the new drivers show a 2.5% to 3% benefit. Optimizations over the next year may provide further improvements, but realistically, we're looking at additional single-digit gains. Is it possible to overclock the 7900 XT to 4080-like levels of performance? Yes. And that's a big asterisk, because at this point, it doesn't translate into every game. But if you primarily only play those games, I think this thing is an awesome deal versus the 4080. But if the games don't overclock as well, for the right price, this is still the best value 4K GPU for the money this generation. For me, I personally see these two GPUs as different tools for different jobs. The 7900 XT is for entry-level 4K gaming, while the 4070 Ti is for 1440p gaming. Even Nvidia brands it for 1440p gaming. My recommendation is to pick the right tool for the right job. I really wanted to go deeper with the 7900 XT. However, when doing the testing in games at 1440p, the performance with ray tracing seemed odd and I started to see flickering. And that flickering was not there before. So I wanted to baseline the GPU by running Port Royal, and it would just fail to complete no matter how many times I ran that benchmark. Sometimes getting open box is not a great deal. I don't know what changed, but at that point, I had less than 24 hours in my return window, and without time to further investigate, I just returned the unit. And that's when I stumbled upon the 6950 XT for a great deal. Even though my time with the 7900 XT was cut short, I am going to continue looking into RDNA 3 with the 7800 XT that I have on order. Since I already have a 6800 non-XT on hand, I can't help myself with the comparison of 60 RDNA 3 compute units versus 60 RDNA 2 compute units, and I'll also compare it to my 4070. If you missed my earlier videos on RDNA 3, you can click on one of these. Thank you all so very much for watching. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next one.